And now, an ad from Dad.
All right, save money on car insurance when you bundle home and auto with Progressive. Can I take these off? All right. What is this? This looks good. Wow, that's well made. Where did you get this? I'm talking to you with the hair. Yeah, where did you get this? It's good stuff. That's solid. That's not veneer, that's solid stuff.
Progressive can't save you from becoming your parents, but we can save you money when you bundle home and auto. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about what happens in an embryology lab, and perhaps most important, why you should care. I think so often as patients we overlook the importance of what happens in the lab, and that's a mistake because what happens in the lab is really important. This is such a great topic, and I really think you're going to enjoy this show. This show is brought to you by Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility and Adoption Education and Support Nonprofit. I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm your host and the director of Creating a Family. You can find us and all of our resources online at creatingafamily.org. This show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. We are so very appreciative of Ferring support. They have been with us almost from the beginning. They really believe in our mission, which is to provide unbiased, medically accurate information to the patient community, and we are so appreciative of their continued support. Hey, listen up, everyone. National Infertility Awareness Week is coming up April 22nd through the 28th. Join us on April 26th, where we'll be having a Creating a Family show to talk about a new campaign brought to you by Ferring Pharmaceutical to inspire, comfort, and support the women and the couples who are navigating fertility. We look forward to sharing how you can be a part of this movement and to help give a voice to the 1 in 8 couples who are dealing with infertility. We've got a great show planned for you that week. And, again, we are thankful for Ferring's support, and we are excited about sharing their campaign with you. All right. In addition to Ferring, we also have other partners who believe in our mission and are willing to support us. You know, we are a nonprofit, but the reality is nonprofits also have to have money to run, and we depend upon donations from you, our listeners, but we also depend upon the support and the contributions from partners who believe in our mission. One of those is IntegraMed Fertility. They are the largest network of fertility practices in the country. And they have a new campaign coming up called Have a Heart Campaign. And the goal is to change the face of infertility to one of hope and support. And you can show your support and help spread the word about infertility by buying some of their fun gear, their tchotchkes, their bling, their whatever, from their website. They've got all sorts of things like sweatshirts and umbrellas and a really cute dog bandana. And I actually have the baseball cap. It is cute, and all of their stuff is cute. And it's also understated, which was, for me, important. It's kind of got the color scheme of orange and white. I really like that. And, of course, because the campaign is Have a Heart, it's got a heart on it. So I got my baseball cap, so I wore it to tennis last weekend, and I got 2 compliments on it. Now, that may be somewhat reflective on the usual status of my hats, which are sweaty and gross looking, and this one was not. But I did get 2 comments of people saying, hey, that's really cute. Where'd you get it? Well, the answer to where I got it was at the Have a Heart Boutique at the IntegraMed.com website. The easiest way to find it, honestly, is just to Google IntegraMed, Have a Heart, and I can't spell boutique easily, so I just put in shop, and it pops up. And you can click on it, and they've got some other really cute gear, and you are supporting a great cause of infertility and infertility awareness. And with Infertility Awareness Week coming up, please consider it. Also, another one of our great sponsors and partners is Cooper Genomics. They are a reproductive genetic testing laboratory focusing on providing genetic tests and services for every step of the fertility journey. They offer carrier screening, PGS, PGD, and non-invasive prenatal screening for individual and couples who are planning a family or going through IVF or early in pregnancy. They're also proud to provide comprehensive genetic counseling to their patients, and I can't emphasize enough how important having a good, qualified, and competent genetic counselor to help you interpret the results. I can't stress how much important that is. So you can check them out at Cooper Genomics. As I was said at the beginning, we're going to be talking today about what happens in an embryology lab and why you should care. We're going to be talking with Dr. Marie Werner. She is a fellow in reproductive endocrinology and infertility at Rutgers, and she's at Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey, where she has completed an intensive 6-month embryology training program. She is also one of the lead investigators of the Summit study. Those of you who are longtime listeners know that I really appreciate good, well-designed research, and one of the missions here at Creating a Family is to be the bridge between the research community and the patient community. It is really important to us to bring you research that will help you in a very practical way make decisions along your infertility path, your infertility journey. And the Summit, the Summit study is one such study, and we're going to be discussing that today. Our other guest is Dr. Michael Tucker. He has been working in the field of reproductive medicine and embryology for probably close to 30 years now. He is well known in the field. He was part of a team that was involved with the first successful baby born through ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, as well as the team that was responsible for the birth of the baby from the first cryopreserved egg. We take all this for granted now. We assume that ICSI and frozen eggs are just are common, and they are common, of course, and a standard part of our practice. But Dr. Tucker was really innovative and part of the beginning and has been involved with some of the cutting-edge research and developments in this field. He has also been a long-time supporter of Creating a Family. In the past, he has served on our board. He has been such a support and, quite frankly, an inspiration for me personally. And to be honest, he's just a really nice person and a fun person. So I think you're really going to enjoy talking to him. He is the Director of Embryology at Shady Grove Fertility and at Georgia Reproductive Specialists. This is a re-airing of a show that we did a couple of years ago. It is one of the best shows we've done on this topic, and as you can tell, I think this topic is a really important one. It has been very popular, and we're so happy to be able to bring it to you again. Enjoy. Welcome, Drs. Tucker and Werner, to Creating a Family.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Good to be
here.
Well,
we've got a real basic question to begin with. It came in from Lisa. She is new at this process. She says, I am confused about exactly the role that an embryologist plays in my treatment versus the role that the doctor plays. My RE will decide on the meds to stimulate my ovaries, and then she turns the eggs over to the embryologist to grow. Is that about right? P.S. I'm new to this, so I am just guessing. So, Dr. Werner, can you address Lisa's question about the distinction between what exactly an RE does and what exactly an embryologist does?
Sure, I'd love to tackle that question. I know our listeners are thinking that maybe this is a more basic question, but really it can be complicated, and it depends on the facility that you might be in. In general, the reproductive endocrinologist does do the initial patient visit and lay out the treatment plan for what strategies might be used for the patient, and that includes everything from medication to the type of the sperm that we're going to use, if it's going to be an artificial intracytoplasmic sperm insemination or if it's going to be a conventional insemination, and then the layout plan for how many days to culture that embryo out in the lab, whether it be 3, 5, or 6, and whether or not those embryos can go back in a fresh or frozen cycle. So the reproductive endocrinologist is laying out the groundwork so that we can determine what will actually happen in the lab. But once those eggs are taken out of the patient, embryologist really has the domain over what happens next. So the embryologist will follow the guidelines given by the clinician or the reproductive endocrinologist and carry out those plans until the embryo is created and either ready for transfer, potentially even for an embryo biopsy or for freezing at that point. And so I think it's a complicated interplay between the endocrinologist and the embryologist. And sometimes it can be altered depending on the facility that you're in, but that's the basic division of labor.
And can you just, again, as long as we're talking about kind of basics here, what is the distinction between an embryo, a zygote, and a fetus?
Sure. Typically, most people refer to the zygote as a very early embryo. So once an egg has been fertilized, and probably until day 1 or 2 of development, on day 3, you start seeing a more formed embryo, so it'll be around 8 cells or so. And then by day 5 or 6, that's when we get an even greater volume to the embryo and many more cells, and that's what we call a blastocyst. Once that embryo has been placed back into mom and starts to grow and implants, and we see a documented heartbeat, most people would call it a fetus at that point.
So once an zygote is a subsection of an embryo, and from a nomenclature standpoint, and then once the embryo has implanted and a heartbeat has been found, at that point it becomes a fetus?
Yeah, I think the definition, varies widely among the population, but that's how we see it from our perspective.
Okay, good. I'm not really sure there's that much confusion about it, but I figure as long as we're talking about basics, we ought to get that one out. All right, we've been doing this show since 2007, and during that time we have seen a steady increase in success rates for IVF treatment and IVF, for infertility treatment and IVF. What advances in embryology and embryology labs and in medicine in general have resulted in this increase of success rates? Dr. Tucker?
Oh, gosh. Well, that's a very complex question. But
I
indeed,
figured, give it to you. That's
true.
But
the last 10 years for sure have seen major steps forward. And to put it into a nutshell, it's probably, in the general sense, it is really about drilling down on selection of embryos so that we're so much more focused now on finding the single embryo, which we can then transfer into the uterus and we hope will have the highest potential to make a healthy singleton baby. So that's where the focus in the industry has totally shifted in the last decade for more. Now, the Europeans were a little bit ahead of us on that in some regards, but we finally sort of got the memo, and that's the case. So in trying to focus much more carefully on selecting the best, most potentially viable embryo, those steps which have helped us get there were in the first instance focusing on the full quality of the first 5 or 6 days of development, instead of putting embryos back at the early stages of development on days 2 and day 3, which is still relatively common in many other countries, and in some clinics even in the U.S. still. And in fact, actually, that there are even some reports going back to the 80s with people transferring zygotes, just to pick up on that terminology. And a zygote is the one-cell fertilized egg stage. That's it's after fertilization, but it's the point at which the embryo is poised to begin dividing and developing. But for fear that we would actually mess things up in the lab through inappropriate culture conditions, many people over the decades have actually explored putting embryos back very, very early on, even at the one-cell zygote stage. But it's still relatively common on day 2 or day 3 of development, when the embryos are somewhere between 4 and 8 cells in composition. But in fact, extended culture throughout the full pre-implantation period has been a key to helping us develop a much more routine transfer of single embryos. Now, how we've done that, and I'm sure we'll touch on this through the Summit study, is development of better culture media systems. Additionally, there's been a great deal of focus on improvement of the actual incubation systems we use. The incubators we use no longer look like big box ovens back in the day that were used for regular cell tissue culture from the labs that I grew up in. Now we've moved to much more miniaturized incubation systems, which have much closer control on the environment. That's been extremely beneficial. And also through the use of time-lapse imagery, we're able to follow the development of embryos through the first 5 or 6 days of development without actually getting us embryologists involved. There are many of us embryologists which have access through our iPads to view our patients' embryos when we're sitting in bed having a cup of coffee or even a glass of wine late at night. Now, that's not routine by any means, but it certainly has been an enormous shift in the field that it has allowed us much greater access and recognition of what's happening during that first 5 or 6 days of development. And that's one big lesson, and I'll shut up after that, but one big lesson from that is certainly being that we recognize the less we disturb the embryos by having a camera which does all the work for us, we're not disturbing the embryos and upsetting their incubation environment. And we've learned, if nothing else, that the less we touch the embryos, the healthier, more potentially viable they are at the later blastocyst stage, which is the very last stage of development, the pre-implantation stage, that we can handle them in the lab before they have to be put back into the uterus to implant.
So at this point, has it developed such that once the egg and the sperm have joined and the egg has become fertilized, you put it in the culture? Do you have to can you watch it at that point? You put it in your incubation system, and you don't ever have to open it up, look at it, do anything. Everything is done remotely from that point on. Or did I misunderstand you, Dr. Tucker? Or is that how?
That is one of the technologies which has been introduced in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, not all my labs have access to that technology, but what it has taught us is that actually you can just take your 1-day-old, one-cell fertilized, normally fertilized egg, your zygote, and put it back into culture. And if you use a single-step monophasic medium, which has become more popular in recent years, then you can actually put that embryo back into the incubator, even if it's an old-fashioned big box incubator, and not touch it for several days, actually through until day 5 of development, so 4 days later, and then and only then go in and observe it. Now, we grew up, and us, believe you me, us embryologists, us lab rats, are very anal. We perhaps have historically looked at our embryos much more often than we should have done, just because we're so concerned and fascinated by observing every potential step along the way. But the problem with that is that you have to take the embryo or embryos out, and usually they come in a dish with a number all clustered together, or even if they're separated, they're in an individual dish or tray. They have to come out of the incubator. That upsets the incubator and upsets the environment in the incubator of any other embryos which don't come out, and then they stay out of the incubator for several minutes or more as they get observed. And during that time, there's potential for the pH, that's the acidity, alkalinity of the culture medium, to drift, and also the temperature to drift down.
Sure, I was thinking the temperature would
be have a negative impact.
Yeah.
Well, we do attempt to we observe the embryos on heated stages, and we certainly try and maintain as benign an environment outside of the incubator as possible by having the labs relatively warm. But we also do it as rapidly as possible. But nevertheless, it's a step that we're learning that we really don't need to bother with, because ultimately what we see at the end point on day 5 or day 6 of development, the blastocyst stage, if an embryo forms to that point, we can relatively easily select which is the most potentially viable. There are, and I'm sure this will come up, there are now also additionally the potential for us to go in and biopsy the outer part of those blastocysts from the trophectoderm and actually screen those embryos for their chromosomal status and check for their chromosomal normality or otherwise. That's a very popular gambit, and it's being pitched very strongly in the industry as a means to add to the selection potential for those embryos. Now, not everyone's going to have enough embryos potentially to justify that. There is the potential risk that even the biopsy process itself is not going to make the embryo better, so that if you have a marginal quality embryo, there is some argument against this process, even if it is opening up the lid, as it were, on the question of whether that embryo is chromosomally normal or not. So I'm sure there'll be more discussion on that topic as we go along here. But certainly that chromosomal screening process called PGS or CCS, complete chromosomal screening, or preimplantation genetic screening, the various acronyms, that is being used much more routinely to add to the screening of those late stage blastocysts before we even put them back.
We did a recent show last week. I think it was last week, on exactly that, the whole discussion of the use of PGS or CCS. I wanted to shift now to a study that's being done at RMA New Jersey. It's the title is the Summit Study, and as I understand it, one of the things I so appreciate about the RMA New Jersey site is that they talk about their research, which is something I'm very fascinated by, and something that we here at Creating a Family are wanting to help disseminate information that the research community is finding to the patient community. There is a dearth of information for the patient community. Not everybody is interested, but many are. Anyway, when I read about this study, as I understand it, that's focusing on the conditions in the laboratory, in the medium that's being used to try to determine what's optimal for embryo growth. Dr. Werner, as one of the lead researchers or the lead researcher for this study, and I know it hasn't been published yet, so I appreciate your willingness to tell us what you're finding along the way. Mm-hmm. Are you comparing different types of media that are currently in use? Is that what you're doing in the Summit study?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Dr. Tucker had referred to this a little bit when he talked about monophasic or single-step medias. And what we're doing is we've determined in our lab that blastocyst culture enables the embryologist and the clinician to select the highest quality and potentially the embryo that's most likely to implant. So what we're doing is comparing two different types of media formulations, one of which is monophasic or single-step media. Some people even refer to it as global media, against a more traditional sequential media. And so in development, the embryo has two large phases. One is pre-compaction and the other is post-compaction. And the requirements of the embryo as it transitions between those two stages is slightly different. So the monophasic or single-step media formulations have everything the embryo needs in relative quantities, and it's exposed to it the whole time, whereas the sequential media has one media developed for that pre-compaction stage, which is until day 3 of development, and then a second media that the embryo gets placed into for the post-compaction stage. And that way it can alter the level of amino acids, glucose, pyruvate, to better accommodate, or at least the thought is to better accommodate the physiologic requirements of what the embryo may need. Now,
let me ask you a question. How do you transfer the embryo from one culture, one dish to another one? Do you suck it up in a pipette and drop it over? Exactly how do you get it over to the second culture?
Right. Well, basically, you have the right idea. So the embryo gets, we use what we call stripper tips, and then you gently aspirate the embryo into a small channel and place it from one media into the other. Traditionally, I would say a majority of labs, and Dr. Tucker can correct me if I'm off on this statistic, but typically take the embryos out of the incubator on day 3 to take a look at them. And so that's when we transfer them, because the embryo is already out of the incubator, and it's placed in usually an isolette where the temperature environments are well controlled, and the embryo is moved from that cleavage stage media to the next stage, which is to support blastocyst development. And you're right, just with a tiny little instrument, and it's a very small channel of material, and it gets aspirated in and then placed back into the next media.
Is the basic goal to try to emulate the conditions? Is the basic goal with media to try to emulate the conditions inside of a woman's fallopian tubes, Dr. Warren?
Yes, exactly. So a lot of the initial research that the sequential media formulations are based upon are based on what the woman's reproductive tract is actually like. So the early embryo, the pre-compaction embryo, is exposed to the fallopian tube or the oviduct, and there it sees differing concentrations of materials such as glucose, pyruvate, lactate, oxygen. And then once it becomes a later stage embryo, the post-compaction nearing day 5 and day 6, it's going to be entering the uterus at that point, where those concentrations of substances are different. So that's where that sequential media philosophy is based upon.
Okay, so because if inside of a woman's body there are different cultures, so to speak, and because it's different places in the fallopian tube and then entering the uterus. So what are you finding? I mean, as I listen to you, I can see the reasoning behind each of them. I mean, it certainly makes sense to disturb as least as possible. Philosophically, that kind of fits with my life philosophy. But on the other hand, I can see the need for. I can understand why, given that you're trying to mimic a woman's inside of a woman's body, I can see the need for two different media. So, what are you finding in your study comparing these two, the single and the multi-step medias?
Sure. So. That multi-step media, I think you phrased it very nicely. It's sort of like a back-to-nature approach, trying to emulate what happens in a woman's reproductive tract, and that single step is we're letting the embryo choose, sort of pick and choose what it needs along the way. So the first portion of the study we completed last year, where we looked at just how likely is the embryo to develop into a day 5 or 6 embryo or a blastocyst that would be suitable for embryo transfer, and is there a difference? Now, the way that we designed the study, I think, is important to just briefly mention. So a lot of randomized control trials will start off with patients and randomize a single patient to one type of media and a single patient to another type of media. What we've done here is actually we've randomized the patient's zygotes. So after fertilization, half of the patient's fertilized zygotes go into sequential media and half of the fertilized zygotes go into monophasic media. So it's a head-to-head comparison for each patient. And so I think that study design is very powerful. And what we looked at this past year was that the difference in the number of embryos that got to each stage was not different for each patient. So if you place their embryos in the single-step media versus the two-step media, their embryos ultimately grew out in culture at the same rate. So that was reassuring because both of these types of medias are FDA approved and widely utilized in labs across the country. So it was good to know that both are acceptable alternatives to embryo culture.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I partly, I guess I'd be a little disappointed as a researcher. I guess I would be looking to say, I want to see an answer. I won't ask you if you were disappointed. That feels a little, perhaps, unfair.
I think it is a fair question, actually, because I think the most important question or the most exciting question for me is how will these embryos do once they're transferred back. So what are the pregnancy rates like for the women whose embryos have been split? And I think that's the most important question, and that question, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you yet on, because that's the portion of the study that's still ongoing.
Are you transferring both embryos back into a woman, or are you freezing one and transferring one? How are you given
so
our
that's an important question. So again, I think this is where the study becomes so powerful, is we're choosing one embryo from the single-step media and one embryo from the two-step media and putting both embryos back in. So every woman in this study, as long as she has an embryo that's grown out in each type of media and suitable for transfer, is getting a double embryo transfer. So we can see which embryo is most likely to implant and create the baby.
Well, here's a stupid question, I suppose, but how do you know once you once you transfer, how do you know which one is which?
Right. So that's a very good question. The way that we do it here is we are chromosomally screening all of these embryos with the technology Dr. Tucker had mentioned, CCS, or comprehensive chromosomal screening. So we take a small biopsy of the outer layer of the embryo, known as the trophectoderm, and before the embryo is implanted, and we run the genetic testing to make sure the embryo is chromosomally normal. By doing that, it also gives us sort of the genetic fingerprint of that embryo. And using mom's blood just taking a simple blood test from mom at 9 weeks, we've been able to fingerprint which embryo it is that actually implants. We can also do it after delivery with, instead of drawing mom's blood at about 9 weeks, we can actually just swab the inner layer of the cheek of the infant and do fingerprinting that way, where we can match the genetic code of the baby to the genetic code of the embryo.
Gotcha. Okay, I should have thought of that. That makes sense, especially after birth. Which is ultimately our goal, is a healthy birth. So I understand now. And does it matter when you transfer two embryos, is each embryo, the first one transferred, the second one transferred, just as likely to implant, or is there some sequence where the first one has the greatest chance, or are your chances equal? And again, this is to you, Dr. Werner, since I'm still kind of talking about the Summit test study.
Yeah, so, in theory, each embryo has its own potential for implantation and the ability to sustain pregnancy. So there are individual chances. So your chance of having one embryo implant that's chromosomally normal in our lab is about 60%, and the chance of that second one is 60% as well. And that doesn't mean that if you have two embryos back that you're definitely going to get an implantation. There are some thoughts out there that maybe having a double embryo transfer may somehow increase the odds of that second one implanting if one implants before the other. But I would say in general they're two separate events, and each embryo has its own separate reproductive potential, which is why we think this study is a feasible one.
Okay, interesting. Let me stop here and take a moment to thank a few more of our gold sponsors and to remind you that it is through their generous support that we bring you this show, as well as all the many resources you can find at our website. We have the law offices of James Fletcher Thompson. They are a South Carolina firm committed to adoption and assisted reproductive law, including providing a gestational surrogacy matching program as well as legal services for independent surrogacy, egg donation, and embryo donation matters. And we have Nightlight Christian Adoptions. They are one of the pioneers in offering embryo donation and adoption services to clients throughout the world through their Snowflakes Embryo Adoption Program. A couple of years ago at the American Society of Reproductive Medicine Conference, I attended a lecture on advances in air filtering for embryology labs that was resulting in increased success rates. But I really haven't heard much about that since then. Dr. Tucker, what is it's possible that I'm not hearing much because it's not a real sexy thing to talk about. Air filtration is not exactly, doesn't feel cutting edge or doesn't feel like significant advances. But what's happening with the whole air filtration systems for embryology labs, and has the research really panned out to show that it makes a difference in success rates?
Well, yes, it has in two ways. The this goes back many years, really, from the recognition that certain substances in the atmosphere of a laboratory, an embryo lab, can have a very negative toxic effect on the embryo development. And these compounds, as they're sort of generally referred to, are volatile organic compounds, or VOCs for short. There's a sort of another aspect to air quality which is a little more tangible in a sense, and that is also the particulate quality of the air in a laboratory. The number of particle counts per cubic meter is attempted to be as low as possible to develop what is referred to as a clean room. And the reason for this, rather more obviously, is to exclude particulate matter which may be contaminating, the most common of which in traditional old school labs were mold spores, particularly common this time of year here down in the south, mold spores that you get into your culture system just through airborne contamination, and you end up getting mold growing in your lab dishes. So that's one of the aspects of cleaning up the air using high-efficiency particulate cleaning tools referred to as HEPA filtration systems. So by applying that technology, as we've done, as very similar to operating room quality air standards, we minimize the amount of particulate content in the atmospheres in the lab. That's been going on for quite a while, but in the last 10, 15 years, the focus has shifted, or additionally has focused on adding potassium permanganate and carbon filtration to the systems to take out these volatile organic compounds. They actually absorb these filter systems actually absorb those compounds and reduce enormously the potential risk in the lab from contamination of that sort. A very common illustration of this would be the lab back in the day that was knocking out pretty good, reasonable results. One day would find all its embryos arresting in development, and somebody would discover that, somebody had decided to come in and renew the bitumen in the car park outside the clinic, and of course the air handling system was pulling in all this toxic fumes from the bitumen coming into the lab. So that's a very classic example of how those kind of volatile organic compounds can impact the lab. So to say that this is not important would be absolutely untrue. So many labs now have much higher quality air, and while you can apply certain Band-Aid systems, bring into old labs stand-alone units to filter out the air, both in terms of the particulate but also the volatile organic compounds, the VOCs, many more newer facilities are having these HVAC systems purpose-built to deliver that quality of air. Now, one last thing, the approach to mini incubation systems, which are avoiding the use of, traditionally incubators drew from the atmosphere in the lab to get their air portion of the gas to put into the incubator. In recent years, the mini incubation systems now no longer tend to do that, or if they do so in a highly filtered fashion. But what they do is they provide an extremely high-quality air system within the mini incubators, which in a sense positively displace, even if you have relatively contaminated external air in the lab, which is not too common, but by applying mini incubation systems, you can actually keep your embryos buffered from that potentially toxic outside air. So not very sexy, but a very real advance in how we approach culture of embryos.
I often think that so many of the advances in the biological sciences especially are and I realize this is not a simple thing, but it's something like it's a more mundane thing that's fascinating. I guess I hadn't really thought about how important that all of a sudden you would be having a well-functioning lab, and then something as simple as something that was happening outside that just slowly seeped, even in probably very minute amounts, seeped into the room and arrested the development of all the embryos.
Parts per million or even billion can have an impact in certain of these compounds. Another classic example is the panic, and in fact now all the clinics I work with, many others I'm sure, actually have a policy before anybody from the building maintenance consider repainting even a corridor several floors away. We get a heads up on that, just in case there's any way we can accommodate that or stop it, or perhaps say, look, let's make sure we use low VOC or virtually zero level VOC paints, which emulsion paints, which allow reduction of any potential VOC contamination into the environment in that building. So it's a lot to think about. And just to come back to the single step versus the sequential medium approach, I think to some extent the seductive nature of the sequential media, which fits in with a very clear hypothesis of the needs of the embryos as they sit in vitro to parallel that they would experience in vivo, actually in the body, doesn't totally answer all the issues, because the sequential media still lack many of the fundamental growth factors that those embryos would experience in vivo in the body. So that's certainly a direction of approach. Addition in a very conservative way, looking to add in growth factors into the culture media, and the single step media, which I had quite a lot to do with over the years. There are probably 4 commercial products out there, as well as Life Global. There's GTL from Vitro Life. There's single step CSC from Irvine, and another one from Sage Culture Media. Everybody's gotten on that bandwagon because they recognize that those single step media give you at least the potential to grow similar quality blastocysts as the sequential media. But there are 2 other key factors which are of great relevance there. One is it reduces the labor in the lab. Now, I'm not trying to say that we're trying to be lazy or anything, but anything to minimize handling of the embryos. Also, perhaps more importantly in many of your eyes, also reduces risk. And Dr. Warner touched on, and you mentioned the moving the eggs and the embryos from one dish to another. That, as routine and mundane as that may be, that is still another step. It's another step to introduce a second or a third dish even that may not have been set up correctly. The more steps you add into this process, the more you elevate the potential for risk. So the beauty of the single step media is certainly that in terms of risk reduction. But it also, just to bring it full circle, there's a pretty famous reproductive physiologist out of England called Henry Leese, who posited a quiet embryo hypothesis several years ago now, that the quietly metabolizing...
Oops. Have we lost you?
But I think that's what the single-step approach certainly subscribes to, and that's why we've tended to favor that approach. And while not undertaking such an elegant study as the RMA group with their double embryo transfers and then the fingerprinting of any subsequent implantation of any fetus, we did single embryo transfers of embryos randomly from the single step or the sequential. This was 4 or 5 years ago now, and happily proved to ourselves that we were getting at least as good an outcome from the single step grown embryos. And if you think about it, the in vitro environment that we generate in the IVF labs are, in a sense, totally unnatural. I mean, heaven's sakes, it intrigues me when people want to minimize and make as natural as possible what happens in the IVF process. And the realities are that we're imposing a totally different set of standards and expectations on these embryos in many respects. So the beauty of the single-step media is that it harks back to a process referred to as simplex optimization, where you basically take an incredibly low-level simple medium and just add in until just the point all the expected requirements in terms of nutrients for these embryos, just to get them to a point where they're optimized, and add in no more, and certainly just enough to optimize the growth of that embryo. There's still more to be done, and certainly I think in the area of growth factor addition to get us there, but we're dealing with an in vitro environment, so we may as well start from basics and work up and optimize that system instead of harking to some sort of hypothetical what happens in nature, let's replicate that in the lab.
Let me ask you a question. I think you blanked out just very briefly, because I do want to move on to a totally different topic here. But you blanked out when you were talking about the quiet embryo hypothesis, and just in case somebody is curious about that, just very briefly, what was that?
Well, the quiet embryo hypothesis is, in very simple terms, it's the embryo which metabolizes in a very quiet way, has no extreme production of stress reactions, having to deal with metabolism. Basically, when an embryo, unless it's focused on its development, which it does so in a relatively modest way, if it has to deal with external stressors, then it starts to have to metabolize, as we do. Say,
okay, yeah, okay, I understand
like
that. Okay,
putting an embryo through a CrossFit test or something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha.
Certainly, it makes it fitter, but it certainly for your average embryo is not going to enhance it, and may take out some of the less optimal embryos, which would otherwise perhaps go on to make a healthy baby.
Okay. Let me move now to address Eleanor's question. She said, I'm going to read it. She said, we found this podcast in Creating a Family because we are looking for a clinic. I have been working my way through the archives of old shows, and they are a gold mine of information. So thank you. You're welcome, Eleanor. I was surprised to see the topic of today's show because I had never really considered the lab part of the clinic. I would like to hear you and your guests discuss what a prospective patient should ask about the lab. What should we be looking for in an embryology lab? Are they all alike so that we don't really have to think about this when choosing? So, Dr. Werner, I'd like to spend the rest of our time talking about what, from a patient standpoint, what should they be looking for when choosing an embryology lab? So let's begin with that, and you could start with the last question, which are they all alike, so she doesn't have to worry about it.
Sure. So I think that was a great question by Eleanor. She, correctly identified something that not all patients really think about and is not widely discussed is what exactly can your lab offer you, and is it different than other labs out there? I think that our philosophy here at Reproductive Medicine Associates of New Jersey is that the IVF embryology laboratory is really the heart of what we do and why we think, our success rates are so high. I think as a patient coming into a new practice for the first time, something that you should make sure, and all laboratories should have this, is that they are certified by CLIA, which is basically like the national governing board to make sure that the embryology labs are following standard procedures. And they should all have a certified high-complexity lab director directing the workflow of the embryology laboratory. In addition,
Aren't they
I think
required to have that, though? I mean, isn't that required that they have a high-complexity lab director?
It is a requirement, and that's the standard set forth by American Society for Reproductive Medicine, so all should have that.
Gotcha.
But I think one of the most important things is really just looking at the success rates, which can be found. It's publicly available on the CDC's website or on the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, just to really look at the success, and you can pick by age group and potentially the circumstance that each patient might be in to see which places have the highest pregnancy rates, and I think that's very telling of what their laboratories are like.
Well, but there's one issue, though, with, and we've done a fair amount on shows on this, the one issue with if you just look at success rates is what you don't know is does the clinic accept all patients, or does the clinic weed out patients that are least likely or strongly encourage or not accepting patients, older patients that won't go to donor egg, and that's not real clear necessarily when you're looking at success rates. Okay, so but of the things you've mentioned, being certified by CLIA, having a high complexity lab, I'm screwing that up, but certified high complexity lab director, what other things should, from a patient standpoint, and success rates, because you're right, that's important as well. Dr. Tucker, what other things can, from a patient standpoint, they ask before choosing a clinic, if they want to consider the quality of the lab?
Well, I would say, and I always try and approach this from a much more global approach, and having worked all around the world in many different labs, while there are differences in the quality that is brought to the embryology side of the equation, which can have an impact on clinical success rates from lab to lab, I would say in the U.S. in general, the differences between labs has certainly narrowed in the last 10 years. So I think that that's one sort of big positive. Yeah, there are still differences in the quality of labs, but be assured that they're nowhere near as wide apart as they used to be perhaps 10, 15 years ago. The other thing I would say is it's also very important if you're discussing success rates that the whole landscape of IVF and how you report your success rates or outcomes is changing enormously, even in the last couple of years or more. Probably the one key area that I would look at if I was a patient or a couple coming to this, I would certainly look at the number of embryos transferred to achieve those outcomes, because certainly as we recognize, multiple pregnancies, twins, triplets, or even worse, are a complete train wreck obstetrically and are seen as much less a success than they used to be perhaps in prior decades. So that's one thing. Check, and you can actually pull up the individual clinic statistics and look at how many embryos across the age groups that they're actually transferring to achieve the live-born outcome. So that's a really key one to look at. The other one is part and parcel whether chromosomal screening is being used routinely for embryos prior to transfer in a clinic or not. But one of the great benefits, the drivers of single embryo transfers, whether fresh or otherwise, is a clinic's ability to freeze, or more specifically, the newer technology is specifically vitrification. If a clinic has a good bottom line in terms of its cryo-embryo outcomes, the frozen embryo transfer section of their outcomes, then that's a big plus, because that's the major adjunct and tool to move away from putting back more embryos fresh, because if you can't freeze and warm them up and get good viability, survival, and implantation in the cryo program, you're not in the 21st century. You're certainly not in the second decade of the 21st century, where vitrification is becoming so much more routine, whether following chromosomal biopsy for chromosomal screening of your embryos or not. The realization that transfer of embryos back into a frozen thaw cycle in a much more, if we're talking natural IVF here, in a much less disturbed endometrium, in a relatively unstimulated or relatively unmanipulated natural cycle for the embryo thaw, those implantation rates are actually higher than when we put back embryos in a fresh, stimulated endometrium. So be assured that, and you can quote me, in 10 years from now, the vast majority of all IVF will be undertaken following vitrification of human embryos.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, and we've talked about it a fair amount, but that the move towards allowing, and vitrification has allowed that. One of the questions that I chose not to ask, but I was under the impression that the vast majority of embryology labs and infertility clinics in the U.S. do utilize vitrification. Dr. Werner, do you happen to know? I might be wrong on that.
I think that the majority of clinics do use vitrification. The other method would be method of slow freezing. But my impression is that a majority of labs out there have solely vitrification programs, and I'm not sure if Dr. Tucker can also comment on that. But
yeah,
Michael,
I
would
know
say there's probably
really
only a
heard
hold
clinics
out.
not using vitrification.
Yeah, I'd say there are maybe 10 to 15% of clinics are now holdout. But this transition to vitrification has occurred very rapidly in the last 5 or 6 years.
Right.
So to some extent, in fairness to those clinics, and it happened in our own clinic, you have a lot of older, slow-frozen embryos to work through. So those lesser outcomes from those slow-frozen embryos will dilute, if you will, your success rates moving forward until you've utilized them routinely in your clinic. One of the things that we've actually had patients request from us is to say, well, I've got 10 of those old slow-frozen embryos. I don't want to pick through them. What if we thaw them out and then biopsy them, screen them for chromosomal normality, and then we can sort of cut it down to the 2, 3 or so that we're actually focused on? Can we revitrify those and come back and have those then warmed again? And we've done that actually a lot, and it's surprising how well they go through the warming, thawing, the biopsy, and the the vitrification, and then the warming again to give some healthy babies following chromosomal screening. So that's certainly a tactic that we've used.
That's just amazing. All right, so we've talked about the factors that, from a patient standpoint, how do they evaluate a lab? Because quite frankly, you know, you can, other than the statistics, people go for a number of different ways. They choose a lab, not a lab, a clinic, but often it's word of mouth. So if we're taking it into the level of actually digging deeper to understand whether the lab is one they want to use, we've talked about the certification, we've talked about success rates, we've talked about the ability to use vitrification, and also number of embryos transferred, although that's perhaps less of a strict indication of a lab as it is a philosophy of...
No. I disagree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I agree
think if you can make high-quality embryos, you're happy to put back fewer of them.
Right, and it would almost be detrimental if you put back too many at once if you're transferring back those high-quality embryos, because you do really get into some serious obstetrical risk factors when you get even twins, but certainly triplets or more higher-order multiple pregnancies.
Okay, so the number of embryos transferred is a good indicator of the quality of the lab, because that's telling you...
Exactly.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so that's another factor. All right, any other factors that patients can... Well, I tell you what, before we go any further, let me read a question from Eric. We actually got 2 questions like this. I'm going to read Eric's, and I'm going to shorten it just a bit. Eric says, my wife and I are going to need donor sperm. We are very worried about getting the sperm to the right egg and then getting the right embryo. What are the standard procedures to avoid mixing up eggs, sperm, and embryo? What questions should we ask? We got another one about this, too. So it is a recurring concern, even though it hasn't been in the news lately. Every time there is a news report of something like this happening, and there is about once a year, it feels like, it is it just sends a ripple effect through the patient community of fear, and it's very real. So let's talk about what's the standard practice for avoiding.
May I chip in there? I mean,
yeah, please.
Dawn, Dr. Warner certainly mentioned the need for the laboratory to be certified, and part of that process is a recognition, the very important recognition of verification steps in what is called chain of custody. And in our case, that's chain of custody of gametes. That's eggs and sperm and ultimately embryos. So in your high-quality clinics, and this is the case at RMA, is every step of the way is verified, whether it's the accepting of the sperm into the laboratory, whether it's the accepting the patient in for the egg retrieval. Somebody goes in and verifies the identity, and ultimately from that point onwards, once the eggs and the sperm are accepted into the lab, there's incredibly careful verification steps. Chain of custody is absolutely central to how we operate in certainly all the labs that I'm involved in, just for the very reason that any mix-ups just wouldn't allow any of us to sleep at night. So I think that's a very important question to ask of any clinic is, can you give us illustration of your standard operating procedures in terms of your chain of custody, how you handle and how you verify each individual step, whether it's egg retrieval, semen receipt, or ultimately the embryo transfer, and even to the point of, how do you track in terms of identifiers your frozen embryos and more increasingly frozen eggs in your system, in your clinic? How do you make sure they don't all get mixed up? So those are very important questions to ask, and you can and should ask the clinic before you have anything to do with them.
And what you're looking for, it sounds like, is your standard operating procedure for the chain of custody. And I'm glad you put in the frozen, because what you're asking for is both the gametes as well as the embryos, and both fresh and frozen. One would assume that the systems would be in place for both, but it would be good to ask. Dr. Werner, any other than asking the chain of the standard operating procedures for chain of custody, anything else you can think of that would be directly relevant that a patient could ask to know that they're getting a clinic with a lab, not just a doctor that they feel comfortable with, but a lab that they feel comfortable with? And I'm going to give you the last word here.
Sure. I think on that first new patient visit, when you're meeting the doctor for the first time, because the doctor is really going to be your interface with the rest of the practice, whether it be embryology, andrology, is ask the doctor what their communication is like with the lab. The doctor should be able to answer every question about what happens to your embryo in the lab, and also be able to explain the procedures clearly to the patient as well. And I think if the patient's able to recognize that there's a clear and open communication between the clinical staff and or the reproductive endocrinologist and the embryology laboratory, I think that's really important, because it's not just the doctor and it's not just the embryologist. It's really the appropriate communication between all sides that can have successful outcomes. So I think it's a very important question for the patient to ask directly to the doctor.
That's a great idea, and see how comfortable they are in talking about what happens in the lab, and that gives you an idea of how good the communication is between the REs and the embryologists. That's a great idea. Well, if you have enjoyed this show, and I'm sure you have, and you want to help us grow, and I am sure you do, please rate this podcast on iTunes. If you have iTunes on your computer or your phone, just type in the words Creating a Family, and we pop right up and you can rate it. If you've got an extra minute, it's a star rating, and if you have an extra minute, you can leave a comment. Or if you don't, just go to the radio page of our website, creatingafamily.org/radio page, and we have click on iTunes, and it will take you to the page where you can rate it there, and we really would appreciate that. We're number one on iTunes, and we would like to continue to be there, so that really does help us. Thank you so much, Dr. Marie Werner and Dr. Michael Tucker, for being our guests today on Creating a Family. If you want to participate in a discussion of the topics of this show, you can check out my blog tomorrow at creatingafamily.org/blog. To get more information, you can about either Dr. Tucker or Dr. Werner. Both of their organizations believe in our mission and are supporters of Creating a Family, so you can go to our website and either click on their name, in this case it would be Shady Grove, or click on the logo for RMA New Jersey, and it will take you to their website. Or if you want to do it the old-fashioned way, you can. To get more information about Dr. Michael Tucker, you can go to shadygrovefertility.com, or if you want to reach them through Georgia Reproductive Specialist, you can go to their website, ivf.com. To reach Dr. Werner or to get more information about her or on the research being done at RMA New Jersey, and the Summit study in particular, you can go to their website, which is RMANJ, that's RMA New Jersey.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will see you next week.
Come to the Home Depot this month and you'll learn a thing or two. Actually, 3, with 3 free do-it-yourself workshops. Learn how to design and care for your container garden by selecting the best soil and aesthetically arranging your plants. Learn how to install tile flooring, even how to keep your outdoor deck and patio space in the best shape possible. See, it's never too late to learn something new. Register today at homedepot.com/workshops for a do-it-yourself workshop near you. Only at the Home Depot. More saving, more doing.